I proceeded down the dark, abandoned street on a cold autumn night, my hands in the pockets of my trench coat as I desperately tried to stay warm. The pavements I tread were already covered in a thin layer of frost, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall from the dark, starless skies above. All in all, it was a bitterly cold night, and I would have preferred to be at home in bed, but duty called. I had an unpleasant job to do this evening, and the cold weather worked to my advantage, as there were few people on the streets, which meant fewer potential witnesses. Using my mental map, I walked down Palmero Street in the Little Italy district and was pleased to find the block abandoned, with not a soul to be seen on either side of the road. So far, so good, I thought. As always, I'd done my due diligence in preparation for this job, and I knew there wasn't any functional CCTV on the block. Nevertheless, I wore my fedora hat low and had a scarf covering most of my face. I knew from bitter experience not to take any chances. My target that night was Scalini's restaurant, a legitimate business with very illegitimate owners. Scalini's was a front for the Luciano crime family, used for money laundering, amongst other illegal activities. Right now, the restaurant was closed for the night, its shutters down and doors firmly locked. I stood for a moment on the icy pavement as snowflakes fell on my head, ignoring the cold and looking past the sealed door and windows to see what lay inside. This is part of my special power, you see. The ability to see through walls and barriers, navigating hidden and secret places with my mind, even when my physical body was unable to enter. In my mind's eye, I saw the restaurant's interior with chairs neatly stacked upon tables and bottles sitting atop shelves behind the bar. For a moment, I considered starting the conflagration at the bar, but realized this could lead to unwanted questions from the police and insurers, not to mention the Luciano family enforcers. And so, my avatar moved on, leaving the main restaurant and entering the kitchen, where I found a wealth of opportunities. Picking my target, I focused all my mental strength on the gas oven, drawing the hidden energy out from the cold air and using my mind to shape invisible atoms into sparks. The fire took root inside of the oven, small at first, but soon growing into a powerful inferno that consumed everything in its path. Soon, the entire kitchen was burning, and the rest of the establishment would shortly follow. I exited my trance state at this point, my mind returning to my body as I no longer needed to observe and control events through my avatar, because now I could see the flames behind the windows and smell the smoke rising from the building's roof. The restaurant's fire alarms were blaring, and I could hear the distant sound of sirens. The firefighters were en route, but it was already too late. My work here was done, and I didn't want to be around when the authorities arrived. So I turned my back on the quickly burning structure and retreated into the shadows and back streets, making good my escape. I arrived home shortly before dawn, remaining as quiet as possible as I threw my clothes into the washer. I didn't think there was a risk of forensic evidence. I hadn't entered the building after all, and there was no smoke or cinders on my clothing. Nevertheless, this was my post-job ritual. I guess I just felt unclean after doing the mob's dirty work. One step closer, that's what I kept telling myself. This attack brought me closer to being free from my obligation to Don Barzini. A few more arson jobs and my debt would be cleared, and finally, I could move on with my life and become a decent father to my child. With my ritual completed, I quietly ascended the staircase and gently opened my daughter's bedroom door. I watched for a moment as she slept, noting how her tiny body twitched under the covers, and she murmured whilst suffering from yet another nightmare. Watching my little girl suffer broke my heart, and all I could do was approach her bed, tuck my child in, and kiss her gently on the forehead in an attempt at reassurance. With this small act of fatherly love completed, I exited my daughter's room and went to my own bed, laying on the hard mattress and staring up at the ceiling. I knew I wouldn't sleep during what little remained of that night, guilt and anxiety eating away at me, as I once again questioned why God had cursed me with this so-called gift. There's no support group for the affliction I suffer from. I can't turn up to the back room of a church and announce, "Hey, my name is Paolo. and I'm a pyromancer. I don't know where I got this power from. Is it hereditary? Could my father do the same things I can? Unfortunately, he didn't stick around long enough for me to find out. And will this curse be passed on to my daughter? Will she inherit my powers once she comes of age? I pray every night that this won't be the case. I wouldn't wish this gift on my worst enemy, let alone the most important person in my life. More than anything, I just want my little girl to have a normal, safe, and happy life, especially after everything I've put her through. What can I say about my own upbringing? I haven't had an easy life. That's not an excuse for all the crap I've done, but it's the truth nonetheless. My father wasn't around, and my mother was a drunk. She had a series of abusive boyfriends, and I was a troubled kid who had taken a lot of beatings. Oddly, I can't remember the first time I created fire using nothing but the power of my mind. I know it started shortly after puberty and was initially closely linked to my emotions. When I felt angry or sad, I burned things, taking small comfort from the flames. I had no real control over my powers back then, and the reckless fires I started burned fiercely, destroying property and sometimes causing severe injuries. It was only later that I honed my skills, controlling both my emotions and the fires as my attacks became more targeted. I eventually realized I didn't even need to be in the same room or building to unleash a fiery inferno. I could leave my body in the moment, becoming an avatar who could move through walls and conjure flames from thin air. I'd like to say that I always used my powers for good, but sadly, this wasn't the case. I was a troubled kid in desperate need of money and sold my powers to the highest bidder, which eventually brought me into contact with the criminal underworld. So many arson attacks followed, too many to remember. In time, they all merge into one horrendous inferno in my memory. I became sickened by the violence and turned to alcohol and drugs, realizing that my powers were dulled whilst I was intoxicated. It was around this time that I fathered a child, but I wasn't there for her and her mother in the early years. My life spiraled out of control, and ultimately, I ended up in prison. This was a turning point for me. I got clean and kept my powers in check, becoming a new man by the time I got released. In a sad twist of fate, my ex-girlfriend died suddenly, and I was forced to become a full-time parent to my daughter, a girl of 10 who'd lived her short life without knowing her father. It wasn't easy taking her in, but this was the best thing to ever happen to me. I wanted so badly to be a good father and law-abiding citizen. But sadly, I couldn't escape from my past. My years of addiction had devastated my finances, and I still owed a substantial debt to my former employers, the notorious Barzini crime family. Threats were made, and I reluctantly agreed to pay off my debt the only way I knew how, by committing untraceable arson attacks and burning rival businesses like Scalini's to the ground. And so, this is the unfortunate situation I was in when my story began. I was walking a tightrope whilst trying to keep my two lives separate, but of course, it couldn't last. I met Silvio Barzini the next day in a mob-affiliated bar on the outskirts of Little Italy, arriving at lunchtime when the place would be quiet. I found Silvio sitting in a corner booth, nursing a small glass of red wine, and noted the finely tailored suit he wore. The mobster's appearance was always immaculate. Silvio didn't rise from his chair as I approached, instead smiling thinly as he watched me closely with his dark, predatory eyes. He motioned for me to take a seat in the booth, which I reluctantly did. Silvio was the Don's nephew and a rising star in the crime family. He was also my handler and assigned me arson jobs, so I had no choice but to deal with the gangster. I knew Silvio Barzini's reputation for violence and didn't wish to get on his wrong side. He offered me a drink, which I politely refused as I wanted to get straight to business. "Was the boss happy with the job last night?" I asked cautiously. Silvio nodded and took another sip of wine before replying. He was content. A small job in the grand scheme of things, but useful nonetheless. I paused for a moment, struggling to ask my next question. "How many more?" I finally uttered. "How many more jobs until my debt is cleared?" I didn't know how Silvio would react to my pressing question. I feared he might become angry, and so I was surprised to see him smile like a crocodile as he met my eye. Funny you should mention it, my friend. We have a big job for you. Very important for the family's future. If you succeed, all debts will be cleared and your obligation to us fulfilled. However, if you fail, there will be serious consequences. I could hardly believe what I was hearing and struggled to comprehend what I'd been told. One big job and I would be free, but Silvio had also delivered a thinly veiled threat, and so I realized the stakes were high. Nevertheless, the prospect of my debt being fully cleared was just too enticing, and so I took the bait. "Okay, what do you need me to do?" I asked. Silvio's menacing grin didn't falter as he carefully reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small folded sheet of paper. "A former associate of ours has unwisely decided to cooperate with the federal government," he explained in a hushed voice. "This traitor is in protective custody, but we have discovered his location." He slid the paper across the table towards me. Glancing down, I saw an address written on it. "Needless to say, this rat must not be allowed to testify. We are trusting you with this important task, Paolo. Don't let us down." I felt a cold chill creeping up my spine as I looked into the mobster's cool, soulless eyes. The implication was clear. The Barzini family was asking me to carry out a murder. The only crime I'd never previously committed. I'd burned down buildings, torched cars, and put people in the hospital. But I'd never killed anyone before. This wasn't a line I wished to cross. But what choice did I have? Silvio had made it clear that failure wasn't an option, and this one last act of violence would finally permit my daughter and me to live in peace. So, to my internal shame, I pocketed the address and meekly nodded my head, agreeing to kill a man in exchange for my freedom. What can I say about my final job for the Barzinis? I spent several sleepless nights going over it in my head, desperately trying to find some way out of the heinous task. But in the end, I could think of no alternative. And so I made my way to the address scribbled on that piece of paper. The safe house was outside of the city and located at the end of a long and lonely rural road. I parked about a mile away from the house and completed the last leg of my journey on foot. It was a cold night for a walk, but I didn't want to pull up in my car and alert the target. The informant was holed up in a literal cabin in the woods, and I was able to hide behind the darkened trees and observe the goings-on inside. My target was sitting in the living room in front of a roaring fire, half asleep as he nursed a glass of brandy. The job would be so easy, I thought. Just one spark from the fireplace and the whole wooden structure would go up in smoke. The feds would be suspicious, of course, but they wouldn't be able to prove it wasn't an accident. It was a simple thing for me to start the fire, and yet I hesitated, and thank God I did so, because a moment later, a second figure entered the living room, a young girl with long, flowing dark hair that jumped onto her father's lap, waking him from his semi-slumber. I watched the father and daughter interact for a time and saw the love between them. And of course, I couldn't do the job. I would not burn a girl the same age as my daughter. There was just no way. And so I abandoned my mission of murder and left the family in peace, retreating through the forest and returning to my car. I knew there would be repercussions for my failure to complete the job, but I didn't expect them to be so sudden and so violent. I was driving my daughter to school the next morning. She was sullen and uncommunicative, sitting in the back seat whilst scrolling on her tablet. My daughter was prone to dark moods and angry outbursts, but I gave my little girl a good deal of slack. She'd been through so much after all, having lost her mother at such a young age. It was my job to protect her, but my chaotic lifestyle was inadvertently putting her at risk. I was still thinking of what to do as we made our morning commute. Maybe I could still make good with the Barzinis. I could tell Silvio that I couldn't do the hit but would continue to work for the family, carrying out small arson attacks until my debt was paid off. It might work, but this seemed unlikely, given the warning I'd already received. I reckoned we'd have to run. I would need to take my daughter and get the hell out of Dodge. In fact, I considered just putting my foot down on the accelerator and driving straight out of town. But events interceded. We stopped at a red light, and I didn't notice the dark Cadillac pulling up beside me, not until it was too late. It all happened so fast. I spotted the dark-tinted window lowering and caught a glimpse of the gunman in the back seat. My instincts burst into action as I shouted a warning to my daughter and dove into the back seat to protect her. Simultaneously, the gunman opened fire, unleashing a stream of deadly bullets that tore through my car, shattering the windows and penetrating the interior. I heard my girl's scream of terror over the thunderous din of gunfire as I grabbed hold of her tiny body. The attack ended as quickly as it began, as the black car sped off through the lights, leaving a scene of devastation behind them. Pulling myself up, I soon realized that I hadn't been shot, but my daughter wasn't so lucky. To my horror, I looked down and saw my girl's wide eyes full of terror and pain. A bullet had torn into her right shoulder, and she was bleeding heavily. I fought hard to control my panic as I applied pressure on the wound, reassuring my daughter as I screamed at a passerby to call an ambulance. 2 days later, I was back on the streets, back on my old stomping grounds in Little Italy. My little girl had survived the shooting, but only just. The surgeons had removed the bullet from her shoulder, and she was in recovery. Her condition was serious but stable. If the bullet had struck an inch to the left, she'd be dead. I should have been with her in the hospital, but instead, I had one last job to do. The fear I had about my daughter's condition was soon replaced by raging anger, unlike anything I'd previously experienced. I knew she would never be safe as long as the Barzinis lived, and I wanted revenge on the bastards who'd done this to her. And so, I found myself standing on the pavement opposite the members' club that served as the Barzinis' headquarters, trying to funnel my seething anger into a targeted attack upon my enemies. I used the full extent of my powers, leaving my physical body as my avatar passed through the walls of the building and secretly observed the scene inside. I counted 7 men in the back room of the clubhouse, including Don Barzini, the grey-haired, overweight boss of the crime family who sat sipping red wine whilst taking counsel from his men. Silvio was there, of course, speaking in hushed tones to his Don about the family's nefarious business. 2 other men sat around the table, well-dressed mobsters who I believed were capos in the Barzini organization. Meanwhile, 3 younger men in tracksuits sat at a separate table on the far side of the room, drinking beers and playing cards. I guessed they were associates or bodyguards. It didn't matter to me, however. All the men in the clubhouse were gangsters and fair game in my eyes. I put all doubt to the back of my mind, focusing all my attention and power on a single point in the room as I was determined to unleash the deadliest and most destructive fire I'd ever created. The fire started at the associates' side table, their cards suddenly bursting into flames as the astonished trio jumped up from their chairs and cried out in dismay. It took a moment for the Don and his captains to recognize the imminent threat. By the time they did, it was already too late, as the flames spread so quickly. I took a grim satisfaction as I watched the gangsters fight for their lives, struggling to escape the growing inferno, but instead being consumed one by one. I particularly enjoyed seeing Silvio betray his beloved Don, refusing to help the old man as he clambered over him in a desperate attempt to save his own skin. As it happened, Silvio made it further than any of the others, escaping the back room and even making his way out onto the street, even though the flames had consumed his body. The doomed man screamed in agony as he burst through the door, and I no longer needed my avatar to see the bastard, as he was standing and burning on the street opposite me. I'm glad I was the last face Silvio saw before his demise, because he knew I was the one who'd killed him. The gangster cried out as he tried to reach for his gun, but his body was burned beyond repair, and he collapsed down to the pavement as bystanders screamed and sirens blared in the distance. I smiled grimly, taking one last look at the raging inferno and charred bodies before I calmly fled from the scene. It didn't take long for the doubts to enter my head as I drove from the scene of the crime, still seeing the rising smoke and flashing lights in my rearview mirror. Honestly, I didn't regret killing those men in such a horrific manner. I thought I'd find it more difficult to take 7 human lives, but I could have killed 700 or even 7,000 if it meant protecting my only child. And besides, those bastards had it coming. Still, I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. I wasn't worried about the cops. Even if they did link me to the crime, there would be no forensic evidence. The mob was another matter, however. Don Barzini and his top lieutenants were dead, but there were many other soldiers in the family who would surely seek revenge. And then there was the commission. The other families might be happy to see Barzini gone, but they couldn't let such a brazen attack upon their organization slide. I knew I would never be safe from this day onwards. But what should I do? I fully intended to spend every hour and day at the hospital until my girl recovered. And then we'd run. The two of us would start up somewhere new under an assumed identity. Maybe it would work out, but I'd always be looking over my shoulder. I felt sick with worry as I walked down the hospital corridor and entered my daughter's room, seeing her asleep in bed, her shoulder wound bandaged and an IV drip hooked into her arm. It broke my heart to see her like this, and I was so distracted that I almost missed the mysterious figure sitting in the corner of the room. "She was awake earlier," announced the intruder. "Still weak, of course, but the girl is strong and resilient. I believe she's well on the way to recovery." I turned defensively to face the newcomer, seeing a smart and handsome man dressed in a black polo neck that shot me a charming smile and met my gaze with sharp, focused eyes. I was understandably on edge and viewed the stranger as a threat, snarling at him as I narrowed my eyes. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded. The intruder shot me a disarming smile as he slowly rose from his seat and held out his hand in an apparent show of friendship. "Forgive me, Paolo," he said. "I apologize for the direct approach, but I just had to meet with you. My name is Mandrake, and I have a proposition for you, one which I think you'll be very interested to hear." I clenched my teeth and refused to shake his hand. Something about this guy wasn't right, and I remained highly suspicious. Honestly, my first instinct was to unleash violence, but this Mandrake character had me in a difficult position. I couldn't summon the flames in this small hospital room without putting my daughter at risk. Besides, Mandrake could easily draw a weapon and take me out before I could use my special power. Whoever this guy was, he was smart and held all the cards. "Are you one of Barzini's men?" I asked defensively. Mandrake let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head dismissively before responding. "Good Lord, no. I'm no gangster, Paolo. Quite the opposite, in fact. I'm not your enemy. Actually, I hope to be a good friend to you." He paused, motioning to the second chair at the opposite side of the room. "Please, Paolo. Please take a seat so we can talk." I didn't like this situation, but couldn't see that I had any choice. So I grabbed the chair and sat down opposite to him. "What is it you want from me?" I asked suspiciously. Mandrake's friendly smile didn't falter as he explained his intentions. "Well, Paolo, I know you and understand your situation. I also know what you did today, and I fully support your actions. Frankly, you've done our city a great service by eliminating the leadership of the Barzini crime family. You have a great power in your hands, Paolo. In the past, you've used these special skills for the benefit of criminals and gangsters. But no more, my new friend. I want you to work for me." I scoffed in contempt before replying, "So, you want me to burn people for your gang? To condemn more innocents to suffer and die?" Mandrake's grin faded ever so slightly as he spoke in a harsher tone. "I told you, Paolo, I'm not a gangster. In fact, I head up an organization of remarkable individuals like yourself who are fighting to end the reign of crime and terror that has plagued this city for too long. I believe you'll make a fine addition to our association." I shook my head, intrigued but not convinced. "No, I can't do this anymore," I replied. "I just want to keep my daughter safe." Mandrake nodded his head in apparent understanding, glancing over at my little girl, sleeping soundly in her bed. "I get it," Mandrake responded. "You're a loving and devoted father. That much is obvious. The Barzini crew deserved to die for what they did to her. But what about the other soldiers? The other families? As powerful as you are, Paolo, you and your daughter will never be safe from mob retaliation. But my organization can offer you both full protection. All I ask in return is loyalty. Now, my friend, what do you say? The charming vigilante held out his hand once again. I stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, thinking over his proposal. I wanted to walk away from all this chaos and violence, but already knew it wasn't so simple. The mob was a threat I couldn't face alone, and a partnership with Mandrake might be the only way to keep my little girl safe. I glanced over at my sleeping daughter again, seeing how vulnerable she looked in that hospital bed, and feeling an intense guilt over how I'd let her down. And then I turned back towards Mandrake, accepting his hand of friendship and shaking firmly. The wide grin returned to Mandrake's face as his eyes lit up. "Good man," he said enthusiastically. "Now, let's put you to work." And so that's how I joined the Supernatural Vigilante Association, an underground paramilitary organization of special individuals using our powers to punish the criminals, predators, and corruptors who stalk our city's streets. Now I burn down buildings and incinerate wicked people for Mandrake. Does this make me one of the good guys? Honestly, I don't know anymore. But I'm no longer afraid of the mob. The only man I fear is Mandrake. Still, I must do his bidding to keep my little girl safe. I'll do whatever's necessary in the hope that one day we'll find a way out. The girl in the graveyard is your best friend, so you take her home. The night is a bruise between you, a blotch of rogue in the passenger window, the color of fruit left out to fester. The body pries at her seatbelt, a finger, then two. The radio echoes static. The body shuffles in her seat. You study the face, the similar slice of jaw, the nose humped from where a baseball had hit her at 12, just slightly off center. The skin like a rain-licked plastic bag. The stink of musk and sulfur. You want to look away, but you cannot. She's so beautiful, even like this. Your headlights rake warbled slits through the dirt road, a yellow like jaundice. Your hands are stiff from the cold, your lips cracked. The girl beside you is dead, and you are bringing her home. 4 days ago, you'd stepped into a hardware store and emerged with a shovel sturdy enough to lift a life on. 4 days you'd spent digging dirt in your own backyard yard until loam muddied under your fingernails and erratic holes split garden beds like the mouths of greedy beasts. Until you could sift through soil with your eyes closed, with a hand bound. 4 nights you had laid in your bed, staring at the pockmarked ceiling, wondering what it felt like to burn alive. Now, the shovel beats dull against the skin of your trunk, your hands gripping the steering wheel like a throat you're trying to silence. The body turns, dawn bleaching the salmon grey of her skin. The left eye slips from its socket and she pushes it back in with the heel of her hand. She smiles, head lolling like a marionette's. "Sorry, baby," her voice comes out strained. "I wasn't expecting company. I'm sure you understand." In a sickle of citrus moonlight, Adeline Marcus smiles up at you with shell-pale gums. Adeline Marcus died on the 31st of October and was buried a week later, the date on her gravestone a month shy of her 18th birthday. In the court, the boys would claim it was an accident, that they didn't know she was inside. For better or worse, you believe them. The fingers striking out matchboxes, the beer cans constellating the sidewalk. A prank gone too far, the wrong place, the wrong time. It doesn't have to be on purpose. She didn't have to be home. The coroner ruled it suffocation. But all you can imagine is flame like a stiff palm striking over and over. Adeline had crawled from the mouth of the home on her hands and knees. She was dead by the time she reached the pavement, her Sunday dress singed up to her knees. The dress you knew well enough. Either way, the boys were left with 25 to life, and the Marcuses were left with a dead daughter, a ring of ash like chalk on the pavement. You were left with a misplaced guilt, like hunger, a guilt like an Ouroboros, choking on the tail, swallowing the head, eating yourself alive and being unable to stop, even as it consumes you. Because this wasn't the sort of thing that happened to good people. You watch water curl down your shower drain, carrying with it mortuary makeup, kaleidoscopic insects and jasmine bubbles. Strings of dirt stretched out like sinew. The body's head rests on her knees, vertebrae needling through her back like a line of molars. The electric lights wash her green, dark veins rooted under brittle skin. She turns her face to the showerhead and picks at the powdery sediment under her fingernails. The shower floor is a mess of grit, and you think of a child scooping up the sand. You turn the heat up until it scalds and scrub mildew from the base of the shower door. You think, if you can only get everything clean, everything will be all right. She turns her head and looks at you through eyes obscured by glass paneling. She says, "It's not as bad as all that. I don't even think I felt a thing." But she says it through lips the color of spoiled plums, so the sentiment doesn't ring true. You lift threadbare towels from the bottoms of your linen closet. You walk 3 times around your block and return to a corpse sat on your sofa like she has nowhere better to be. There are ants in your sugar bowl. You try to remove them, lift their crystal-knotted bodies on the prong of a fork, but they slip between the gaps and you are left with a mess bigger than when you started. Tea-brown sludge bleeding from thoraxes and the stink of vinegar. There's a dead girl on your sofa, but let's focus on the ants in your sugar bowl. The way they thread through cysts of white like veins on a leaf, like the capillaries that run through the skin of your face. You make tea anyway. You add too much milk and sit cross-legged in front of the body. She stares at you. You stare back. The two of you drink, and ribbons of watery milk pour clean out her trachea, the gaping hole in her chest. But she doesn't stop drinking until you do. "You're not looking at me," she says. "Not really." "Yes, I am." You twist your hands in the shag carpet. "Aren't I now?" "No," she says. "You're not." You leave your teacup on the floor, saucer and iris of yellow, and go upstairs. You take 2 cigarettes from the carton squashed on your father's desk and then think better of it. Press down with your heel until tobacco dissipates into the tawny carpet. You change your bedsheets twice. Eggshell white? No, grey with peonies. You make a second cup of tea. When you get back to the room, the body is still there. You are looking at her. You are not looking at her. "Do I disgust you?" she says. "No." She shakes her head, dark hair plastered to her shoulders like reeds. "No more than I always did." "You need to sleep," you say. "Baby," she tilts her head to one side, "sleeping is all I've ever done." The last time you saw Adeline Marcus alive was in the back of a stranger's car, parked on a stranger's street, with the taste of a stranger's tequila fresh between your lips. You were never too built for parties, so the outcome was a pair of girls who looked like they were playing dress-up. Blousy dresses with sleeves like a nun's, thrift store necklaces noosing your necks, shoplifted lipstick which she hid beneath her mattress, more wax than pigment. But in the citrus peel of street lights, in the low trill of distant music, the two of you looked beautiful. She had her legs curled under her and was sitting sideways in the back seat, her hand resting on your knee and the other palmed against the window, a song on her lips that you couldn't quite place. You were too close, but it was night, and everyone was inside and drunk. And sometimes we all need to feel closer than we should be, to lose ourselves a little. The song melted on her lips, swallowed into the limp press of salvia and booze, and you said something like, "I think I should go home now." And she said something like, "Have another drink." And so you did. You let her pour the liquor into the flimsy mouths of red plastic cups and watched her swallow. She said, "You're so pretty." And you said, "I think you should stop." And she said, "Just let me say that one thing." And you wanted to say, "Stop fucking looking at me like that." And you wanted to say, "I want to crawl inside you and make a life for myself in the city of your mind." And you wanted to say, "Let's just be quiet. Let's just not talk. Let's just not ruin a good thing by telling the truth." Instead, you pushed open the passenger door, stumbled out onto the skin of vein blue sidewalk. "I'm going home now." The body lays with her back to your bed, hands worming in the floral sheets, chestnut hair spilling across her throat, past the ballpoint pen-marred bedposts, over the grey skin of her forehead. You are thinking about the silken mouth of a coffin. You are thinking of how she looked when you pulled her from the rose mouth of heaven. The radiator hums, a lace curtain bellies your open window. She rolls over onto her side, slots her hands together like pieces of a decaying jigsaw puzzle. You still can't even look at me. Her mouth moves too slowly, words like chewing gum. Why am I here, Bet? What's it for? There are pink crescent moons on the bed of your palms from the bite of your nails. She pulls her knees to her chest, and a bone cracks. She pulls her knees to her chest, and a molar tumbles from between her keyhole lips. You can only love me when I'm not here. You can only love me when there's nothing left to love. You press your cheek to the cool spread of linen beside her. You listen to the steady beat of your heart, the way you can feel it in your fingertips, entirely singular. Don't tell anyone, you say. Did you want it to die with me, Bet? She shifts, and her hair falls against the nape of your neck. Were you glad it was silenced? Don't tell anyone. You say again. She sighs, lays herself back down so you're face to face. Crooked nose, eye pulling from its socket, the onset of grey-green decay wreathing her jaw, the smell of soil and rot and cicada-heavy nighttime. Who could I tell? She brushes your hand. I'm not really here. And suddenly you can imagine, it is your fists splitting beer cans in two like overripe fruit. It is your fingers on the matchbox, your fingers striking out. But you both know the house would still be on fire, and you both know you'd leave alone. You take her hand. You put your face in the crook of her neck and beg forgiveness from a ghost. The squat blue-grey building hummed with danger. Was this where he would find Sophia? Whatever happened, Otis knew after tonight everything would change. Even in the barren wasteland of the old industrial district, the cement block warehouse stood out. Like an ancient mausoleum, the words "Ghost Ship" were painted in 6-foot-tall letters high across the front of the crumbling facade. An auto body shop and a cell phone store girded in steel bars shared the block, but the warehouse was a thing apart. It breathed, alive with a rumbling and heaving wheeze from deep inside its bowels. Multicolored lights strobed and blinked out of dusty second-floor windows, as if searching for its next prey. A side yard held the desiccated remains of past victims. 2 yellowed mobile homes cantered into each other, between broken appliances and skeletons of old furniture. A large construction of metal and wood reached a desperate arm up, its futile effort to escape reflected in red, orange, and yellow lights from the windows. You really think Sophia will be here? I thought she had left Oakland entirely, Otis said. In khakis and a thin jacket over a polo shirt, he shuffled backwards to get closer to Daisy. An unease crept up his thighs and crawled into his belly. Maybe he was just too old for this. Women and men, girls and boys really, walked by him toward the ghost ship as if he was just another stop signpost, easy to ignore on the cold and clear December night. Daisy, 22, the same age as Sophia and his last connection to her, wore a button-front jean skirt and a bomber jacket over a cropped black t-shirt. She stepped away to put more distance between them. Like I said on the phone, Mr. Shea, she reposted the link to this show by Golden Donna. If your daughter's into them, she will be here. The ghost ship shows are insane. You can call me Otis, Daisy. He stared at the grey building as it swallowed people one by one. Maybe I'll just watch for her out here. He rubbed his bald head. He examined each woman who walked in, scrutinizing their hair and the tilt of their shoulders, hoping for Sophia. Guilt at her disappearance gnawed at him. Would he even recognize her? And if he found her, would she listen to him? A cold wind blew from where Daisy had stood, and he found her walking across the street. Come on, you have to see inside. After 6 days, this was as close as he had been to finding her. The police were no help. They just repeated the same questions over and over, practically blaming him for her disappearance. He had found Daisy on Instagram, and after listening to his story, she agreed to help track down her old friend from middle school. He needed to find Sophia, convince her to listen to reason, before the police found her, or his world would fall apart. He followed Daisy. Rust and graffiti covered the large metal roll-up door to the warehouse, shut tight for years. Otis followed Daisy through the small door cut into it, the only entry into the building. Dust, mold, and the stink of unwashed bodies assaulted him. Otis blinked against the dim light, and at the unbelievable scene that surrounded him. Antique pianos and organs created a labyrinth into a large foyer. He had stepped through a mystical portal, a time machine back 100 years to a world where modern plastic hadn't been invented. Items of dark wood, steel, or bronze were everywhere. He dodged an overstuffed red leather chair to enter a lounge area where three red and black checkered cloth lamps balanced on an Art Deco radio festooned with a string of white lights. Old couches covered with rugs and ottomans dotted the space. He saw a stairway to his right, while a hallway, created by positioning wood pallets and drawers stacked to the ceiling, stretched out ahead of him. Light from nearby rooms leaked out of the walls around him, made up of wood scraps hammered into rough 2x4 frames. Paintings and tapestries covered the partitions, picture frames, posters, and clocks hung from nails and balanced on tilted shelves. A faded red and green flag stapled to the ceiling sagged down, brushing his head. Otis ducked, lifting his hands to hold the walls back that suddenly seemed to squeeze in. He couldn't get enough air. He gasped in short breaths. A hard edge poked sharp into Otis's shoulder, and he leapt to the side, landing on a fire extinguisher and then overturning a stack of hardcover books. They clattered to the floor, bouncing off the layers of rugs covering the cement. He then made the mistake of looking up. Glaring down above him, a green, 5-foot-tall statue hovered, a giant birdman with partially open wings, its hand reaching out for him. Oh my God! Electric fear sparked up his back, shooting him to his feet, escaping backwards until he backed into another wall, rattling the statuettes, a collection of 12-inch tall black jazz musicians on a shelf. Otis spun away again. Shit! What is this? That's a statue of Garuda, Daisy said, pointing to the green god above her. Hindu god of flight. There's so much junk. It's art. Daisy waved both hands. Isn't it amazing? All made and collected by the artists in this collective. Is this place legal? Maybe we should go. Otis squeezed himself tight, trying to breathe in the cramped space. Why don't we look through the downstairs first? Daisy pointed to the narrow hall. The walls of the hallway contained scraps of wood siding and old recycled doors in different fading colors. 2 steps down the hallway, Otis looked in a room to see 2 men and 1 woman laid back on couches, feet stretched out on a fur-covered footstool. Another woman painted a man's fingernails, her purple hair gently swaying as she leaned over her work. An old swing tune poured out of an ancient record player, mixing with the thick cannabis smoke in the airless lounge. The singer on the scratched record crooned, "Don't want to set the world on fire." Turning into the next cubbyhole room, Otis saw a silver Airstream trailer on 4 flat tires across from several mushroom-infested couches and an ancient television in a wooden frame. Across the hall, a yellow light illuminated a small room. An upright piano leaned against a tilted love seat next to an armoire overstuffed with clothes. Thick orange extension cords stretched across the ceiling and along the walls. A hot plate and electric kettle balanced on one small table. A camping stove with several green butane tanks squatted next to it. People live here? Otis asked, mouth gaping. I thought you said it was an artist's studio and a theatre. Yes, and a place to live, Daisy said. Where else can an artist find a roof over her head? Rents are impossible. People are desperate. Do you know another place like this? Not everyone has first months, last months, security deposit, credit score. Daisy counted on purple manicured fingers' rental requirements. These people living here play music, write stories, they create art exhibits, anything to create beauty. Daisy shrugged. Just because they live on the creative edge, they shouldn't get to eat, have a place to lay their head? Daisy turned to sit on the bright green velvet love seat, rubbing the soft material under her hand as her eyes caressed the collection of pre-war movie posters high on the wall. Wouldn't you want to live here? She pointed. Bet Davis, Ingrid Bergman, oh, Clark Gable. Ah, I would thrive here. She threw her head back. It's safe, like a warm, cozy nest. How could someone live here? It's all trash and dirt and so many people. Otis sneered. A sleeve of a faded jean jacket reached out to Otis from the Art Deco wardrobe. Its specific color and worn cuff flared his memory like a struck match. Sophia hadn't wanted to stay, but he offered a glass of wine, a slice of the pizza he had ordered in. That night was special. They shared stories, and he knew she felt it too, their connection. They had been so close, her bright, joyful laugh. Once she passed out, he had carefully removed her jean jacket, the soft cloth still warm from her body. Then he moved on to the rest of her clothes. He lifted up his sleeves to his nose. Did it smell like her? Her skin? Her hair? He fought his memory, trying to remember what she smelled like. I was at a frat party at Cal last weekend. Daisy interrupted his thoughts. This place is way nicer than that cesspool. Less chance of getting drugged and raped too. Daisy stood, folded her arms, then popped her hip out. We should go. Otis pushed the sleeve back into the closet, but instead of staying put, the jacket fell out. A hand-drawn zigzag pattern of black lines covered the back panel of the jacket in an artistic swirl. A design he recognized. "This is Sophia's jacket," Otis cried out. He pulled open the door of the armoire as if Sophia herself was in it, pulling out dresses and jeans, underwear and bras, leggings and sweaters, tossing them all onto the Persian carpeted floor. "What are you doing?" a voice screamed behind him. Otis turned, but the young woman was not Sophia. "I'm looking for Sophia, my daughter. She's not in my closet. Damn, those are mine." The woman squealed louder, diving against Otis to shove him away, grasping a pair of black leggings and a pink bra tight against her. She waved the bra at Otis. "Don't you know to leave other people's possessions alone?" Light pink hair covered her face. Black drips of mascara streaked against pale cheeks. "I'm sorry, it's just this jacket. Where did you get it?" Otis stammered. "A girl gave it to me. I said I liked it, and she pushed it on me, something about memories." The girl's eyes darted between Otis, Daisy, and her clothes piled on the floor. Was she, light brown hair, about 5'5", brown eyes? Otis leaned in, searching for recognition. The girl collapsed down amongst her strewn clothes. "Maybe. When's the last time you saw her? Yesterday? Day before? She's around. She lives here." Tumblers in a puzzle box clicked, an answer for how she could have disappeared so completely from his search. "Probably upstairs right now. She loves that kind of music," she said. "What's your name?" Otis asked. "Jojo." "Thanks for your help, Jojo. If you see her again, let her know her dad's looking for her." Otis gripped the jacket in both hands. He spun slowly, blinking against posters, scraps of wood, and overstuffed couches surrounding him. He couldn't even find the door where he got in. "How do we get upstairs?" "This way." Otis pointed past a small mobile home up on blocks. "No." Jojo gestured to her left. "There's only one way up, the front stairs." "Jacket?" Otis handed it back, nodding to Daisy. "Let's go." The lights flickered once, then twice. "What's that?" Daisy jerked up. "Happens all the time." Jojo shook her head. "The electricity here is whack." The crowd, all young, beautiful people, had grown. One by one they flowed in through the small door, filling the front lounge, spinning, pointing, and laughing at the art stapled, nailed or glued to every square inch. A queue formed to get up the stairs. The switchback, handmade steps, pieced together from wood scraps and packing pallets, shook so much Otis held up the line, waiting for them to clear before he felt safe walking up. Otis came up through a hole cut in the second floor. He peered through a doorway into another small apartment at the top of the stairs. A bright pink and green comforter, smiling dolls, and a pink stuffed cat sat on the lower level of a short bunk bed. "Kids live here," Otis pointed. Daisy shook her head. "I hope they ain't here now." They passed a tall stack of old box radios lined up along the wall before turning into the theatre space and a crush of humanity. 100 people or more danced and swirled in the multicolored lights, shaking the floor in the damp heat. The room stretched out to take up most of the top floor of the warehouse. At the far end, a nasal-voiced man wailed into a microphone over another smashing on a drum kit behind two women playing guitars. Tall black speakers pumped out the raucous music among antique chairs, pianos, and jukeboxes collected alongside the stage. Wooden sculptures floated above in the metal rafters, their swaying movements following the dancers below. Otis couldn't see anything, couldn't tell one person from another in the dim lighting and swirling dust. He circled the room, dodging the dancers before coming back to Daisy. "There's too many people," he shouted above the music. "I don't know if I could find her even if she was here. I'll come back in daylight." An impossible vision materialized out of the haze. A woman with brown hair buzzed on one side, and a profile that had been etched in his dreams. "Sophia!" Otis shouted. She turned, her face bright with joy and energy toward them. "Daisy? Why—" And then her eyes caught his, and her face dropped into shock. "Otis Johnson?" she mouthed. "God, no. How are you here?" Otis's throat closed until he could not speak. The words he had thought about, had practiced for days, all flew away. Guilt from his actions clawed at him. He needed to explain himself. It was all just a misunderstanding. "We found your daughter," Daisy clapped, beaming with joy. "Sophia?" Otis reached out and grabbed her arms, pulling her in as he shouted, "It's over. You need to go back home and tell the truth, not those made-up lies you told the police." Anger blazed inside him. Her words had ruined his life. He had made a mistake, but should he have to pay for it forever? She needed to listen to him, or else. Sophia shook her head. "No, that date was the worst night of my life." Her jaw clenched. You... An odor touched the edge of his consciousness, but he tried to push past the noise, the bright lights, and now this smell assaulting his senses. What was Sophia trying to say? Otis twisted his head to put his ear near her mouth. A movement across the room caught his attention. A man pointed, shouting words he couldn't hear over the thunder from the speakers. Sophia spoke again. Otis felt her hot breath on his cheek. "You fucking raped me. You drugged me and raped me, then threatened my life. You're a monster." "What?" Otis said. Then it all flooded in. What he had been trying to block out. Fire. The music turned to distorted squeals as the musicians dove into the crowd still holding their guitars. The drummer fell into his kit. The cymbals crashed while he still held his drumsticks up, waving them as magic wands to stop the smoke. The wall behind the now empty bandstand flickered orange, while black smoke curled up the wall, thick arms shooting into the rafters before its fingers began stretching back down. "No!" She twisted free and tried to leave, but the crowd running to escape held her in place. A boom echoed in the room, and the back wall fell in, a huge bellows forcing hot air and flames toward them. "We have to go!" Daisy ducked against the heat. All around them, people screamed toward the staircase. Dancers, who moments ago swirled in the music, rushed to the exit, clogging the narrow opening. The black fingers of smoke curled down and around to grip each person as if in a fist, clogging their airways, blocking their vision, and throwing them into confusion. The life-giving air became the enemy, hot and black. One breath hurt, 2 breaths knocked you to your knees, 3 breaths killed. Otis squeezed Daisy and Sophia close, against the screams and shouts of the running madness. A man swung a fist, clipping Otis across his eyebrow. A thunderous crash banged below them. "The stairs collapsed!" a voice shouted. Shoved back again, they were suddenly against a cement wall, bodies pressing them hard. The cold wall acted as an anvil, while the crowd hammered against them over and over again. Through his shirt covering his face, the smoke burned his eyes, burned his lungs. They were stuck. Would he die here? The reality of the danger came to him as visions from the floor below. So much wood, furniture, and paintings filling every inch. A giant box of tinder. Seconds more, and it will erupt into a roaring inferno. The cold wall gave him an idea. Blind from the smoke, he could only feel along the concrete until his fingers reached the hard glass of the industrial windows. He slammed his arm into the metal and glass once, twice, and then pulling back, he dropped his shoulder, and with a snap, he was through. Hope blew through the cracked window, along with the cold, fresh air. "You have to jump!" Otis shouted to the two women. He cleared what he could of the glass, the sharp edges slicing his hands. Feeling their hesitation, he pushed them both out. Otis invoked the god Garuda as the two women leapt away from the fire, disappearing into the billowing smoke. Otis stood at the window against the cold air of reality. He had found Sophia, but the illusion he could escape his fate was over. He turned back into the inferno. Someone followed me on my morning run. At first, I didn't think anything of the blob of pink flesh and neon green clothing far behind me on the trail. But as I made one turn after another, I noticed that the blob stayed on my tail. No, it was getting larger. Uneasily, I sped up. It was just paranoia, I knew, but someone tapped me on the shoulder. I whirled around, my hands raised defensively. Neon green tracksuit. Brown hair pulled into a tousled ponytail. She looked like an entirely average young woman, except her expression was all wrong. Her eyes were open too wide, framing her irises with a ring of frantic red veins. Her mouth was pulled into a fixed smile, like the corners of her lips had been pinned to her cheeks. She spoke, her face not moving, except for her tongue flicking out between bright white teeth. "It's not in your attic." Then her face dropped into a relaxed expression, and she jogged past me. I stood there for a moment, my brain stuttering, before I convinced myself that it must have been a prank of some sort. Pushing the incident from my mind, I went home, showered, and headed to work. But her words stuck with me. There had been sounds from my attic last night, thuds and groans overhead at 3 a.m. Animals on the roof, I thought, the wind whipping through the branches of the old oak. But what if it had been something more sinister? As soon as I got home that evening, I went to my bedroom and pulled down the ladder to the attic. The dust-covered rungs led up into stifling blackness, a dark slash in the ceiling that held its breath as it waited for me to enter. I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer from my toolbox before climbing up. The attic looked exactly as I remembered it, every surface covered in alternating stripes of pale wood and staticky insulation. Nothing looked amiss until I got to the far end, where I found a dark blob that spanned several planks. The insulation in between was darker too, an unsettling reddish-brown. I touched one of the planks. It was wet. A slimy monster, the paranoid voice at the back of my head suggested, feasting on gory prey. Or, my common sense argued back, a water leak. Satisfied, I headed back down, making a mental note to call a handyman. Still, I slept fitfully that night, my ears straining for every whisper of sound. The floorboards creaked constantly, but the attic, thankfully, was silent. Exhausted, I called an Uber to work the next morning. The driver, a middle-aged man with round glasses and thinning hair, chatted amiably about the weather as he pinched and zoomed on the route on his phone. He stopped mid-sentence. Confused, I looked up from buckling my seatbelt. Number bulging eyes, cracked lips, hoarse words slipping through an unnaturally stretched smile. "It's not under your bed." Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that lead them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphone. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response: "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed. While the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place, the skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out, to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach, and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, a former KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might, first left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering from brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flatlines as one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, "So, nearly free." This is based on a true story back in Laos. Back in Laos, when Hmong people were still wearing Hmong clothes, a sister and her sister-in-law went to the farm early in the morning, each of them wearing 2 zav, the silver plaits around the neck. When they got to the farm, the SIL told the sister to go pick cucumbers from the top of the hill, and SEL herself will go pick cucumbers from the bottom of the hill. The sister did as she was told and went up the hill to pick cucumbers. Once her back basket was filled with cucumbers, she returned down to the spot that her SIL directed her to go uphill and called downhill to her SIL. She called, "Seal, is your back basket full yet? If it's full, come up and let's go home." But there was no reply. She called a few more times, yet there was still no reply. Fearing something had gone wrong, she quickly set her back basket down and rushed downhill to check on her SEL. When she reached downhill, her SEL was nowhere in sight, but next, a tree stump was her SEL's back basket filled with cucumbers. Next to her, SEL's back basket was one of her SEL's shauv. She scanned the surrounding again, checking to see if there has been any struggles within the area, but noticed no difference. More downhill, there was a small river. So the sister thought to herself, maybe her SEL went down to the river after picking cucumbers to wash her hands. So the sister decided to go down to the river to look for her SEL. But after about 10 steps forward, the sister saw the other zov of her SEL. By now, her heart started racing, but she quietly told herself to be brave and ran all the way down to the river. Once she reached the river, she called out to her SIL again, and once again there was no reply. Now she was really scared, so she turned back and started running up the hill, grabbing both her SIL's zav as she passed them all the way to her own back basket and put it back on, and rushed home. When she reached home, she told her parents and Xiong, the brother that married her sister-in-law, what had happened. Xiong quickly went and gathered about 15 to 16 men in town to go look for his wife, each man carrying guns and knives in their hands. However, after a whole day of searching, there was still no sign of his lost wife. Night started covering over the hills. A couple of men started saying, "It's getting dark and we can't find any sign of her, so let's go home and return back tomorrow to look again." Crying, Xiong replied, "No. We are men here with knives and guns. There is nothing to fear. We should continue this search till we find my wife." Although most of the men wanted to leave because they were starting to feel chills, seeing Xiong crying, they felt bad for the man, so they decided to continue the search with him. But the deeper they went into the woods looking for Xiong's wife, the more chills they started feeling. With each chill, goosebumps started rising on their fleshes, and their heartbeats started racing. About 10 minutes later, Xiong heard his wife's voice echoing in the air. "Xiong, I'm over here. Come over here." Xiong turned to the rest of the men and said, "I hear my wife calling me over there. She said she's over there. Did you guys hear it too?" All the men now stopped dead in track and glanced at each other. They shook their head and replied, "No, we did not hear anything." Before Xiong could say anything else, he heard his wife's voice calling him again. He looked towards where his wife's voice was echoing from and pointed ahead. "My wife is calling me from ahead, so we are going to move ahead." Before anyone could stop Xiong, he pushed on forward, hearts racing faster and fear beaming on all the men's face. They trailed closely after Xiong. 5 minutes later, everyone, including Xiong, stopped dead in track again. For this time, they all heard Xiong's wife's voice ranging in the air. "Xiong, I'm over here. Come over here." One of the men noticed the voice was too close to them, so he quickly said, "Your wife sounds very nearby. Let's get our guns ready." Everyone started pulling bullets out of their pockets and stuffing it in their guns. As Xiong reached into his pockets for his bullets, he pulled out instead his wife's ring. By now, Xiong's heart shook with chills as he said quietly, "This is my wife's ring. She wore it this morning. How did it get into my pocket?" Upon hearing this, everyone now shook with fear of what was going on, but they pushed forward. However, after 3 to 4 steps only, they saw on the ground in front of them Xiong's wife's dead body, which was torn and eaten all by something. The only parts left were the head connected to half her neck and left shoulder to her arm. By now, night had covered every inch of the woods. One of the men turned to Xiong and said, "Now that we have found your wife's body, it's too dark to do anything, so let's cut down some wood and bamboo and make treehouse above ground to rest. When morning calls, we will take your wife's body home for burial. If not, we will bury her here tomorrow morning because her body is not a good sight to bring into town anymore anyway." Everyone agreed with the man that said this, so everyone quickly helped chop down trees and bamboos, and by 11:30 managed to make 3 tree houses. Once everyone was up in each treehouse, they could still look clearly down at Xiong's wife's body on the ground. By now, it was around 12:40-ish. Xiong's wife's head started turning to look at everyone and smiling at them. Even though they were all men, seeing this sight made them feel lifeless. After Xiong's wife's head turned and smiled at everyone, it turned back to its dead position and laid still again. Now the man that told them all to make the treehouse directed that no one is allowed to go to sleep. They are all going to stay awake and see what's going to happen next. An hour later, Xiong's wife's head turned again and smiled at them. This time, her hand, too, raised up as if pointing to them. By now, some of the men peed in their pants without shame. Another man in the group thought for a while and said, "It looks like she's trying to tell someone or something that we are up here." Once those words were out, everyone started shooting guns down below around Xiong's wife's body. Another man said, "This is too scary. We all have to man up and stay till dusk. We are not going to take her body home. We will just bury her here." After talking about it amongst themselves, everyone agreed. By 4 in the morning, they climbed down, divided the men into 2 groups, a group to dig Xiong's wife's grave, and a group to guard the surrounding. They managed to bury Xiong's wife's half-body. Before leaving, Xiong kneeled in front of his wife's grave and cried, "I loved you so much when you were alive. Why did you treat me so nasty now that you are gone? Is it because there is something or someone I cannot see forcing you to do this to me? No matter what, even though you scared me like this, I will love you always. Our life together will end this way. Sorry I'm not able to take you home with me." After that, everyone came home, and the story of Xiong's wife echoed throughout town. This story was first told by one of the men that went with Xiong that day, and since then it has been passed down generations after generations. Everything was great when my husband and I first moved into the new apartment in Fresno, California. We were finally getting our life started. We just moved out of the in-laws, not saying I hated living there, but it was finally the real deal. Living on your own, paying your own rent, buying your own food, and etc. I've always been the very independent type, so it was exciting to get that kind of freedom back. Anyways, our apartment was small. The door opens to a small square-shaped living room with a huge ocean view window. To the right is the kitchen with a small dining area. Once you entered the living room, straight ahead of you is a short hallway that leads to the bathroom and bedroom, one-bedroom apartment. The whole apartment flooring was a pale wood, except the bathroom and kitchen, which was a floral tile. The window panes were painted red. The apartment was small but cozy and a good place to start off our life. Plus, I liked how the apartment was a little further away from the usual busy areas of Fresno, more towards the farm areas, outskirts. When we first moved in, my father-in-law came and did a cleansing in the apartment because he's a very traditional Hmong man. Not saying that I'm not. For a matter of fact, I'm also very traditional, but I didn't think much of it because the apartments were pretty newly built, 2 to 3 years old. After my father-in-law left, my husband and I spent a couple hours digging through our boxes, but once I grew tired of not knowing what to put where, I told the husband to take me to the store to get some furniture to put things on. We left and went to the store for a good 4 to 5 hours. It was dark by the time we got back, so we showered and immediately went to bed. Slept on the floor, of course. The next morning, my husband left early for work, so I decided to go move some of the boxes into the kitchen and dining area, so that when the delivery guys got there, I can just have them set up whatever we needed them to. But as I was moving the boxes around, I kept noticing long strands of hair on the ground, and some on and in the boxes. It wasn't enough to be noticed right away, but as I moved more and more boxes, I realized that it was pretty much spread throughout. I knew for sure it wasn't mine because I actually had a short A-line cut during that time, and of course my husband had a clean cut. I didn't give it much thought because my sister-in-laws were helping us pack during the time we were moving out, and they both had pretty long black hair, so I just thought it might have been theirs. Since we left the window open last night, we live on the second floor, the wind might have blown the hair everywhere. After I finally finished moving the boxes and swept the floor, I went into the bedroom to put away our blankets to make room for the bed when it arrived. But as I was folding the blankets, I also noticed long strands of hair around the bedroom, but mostly right around the corners of where we slept last night. Honestly, I was a little freaked out, but decided to brush it off and just quickly sweep the room. Later that night when my husband came home, I brought up the subject to him, and he just shrugged it off and also suggested that it might have been his sister's, which somehow comforted me a little, and I just left it as is and left for work. I worked night shifts. A couple days later, I got up around noon, because I work late, when my husband had already gone to work. I decided to finish unpacking and maybe go out to do a little grocery shopping. While I was cleaning and unpacking, I also noticed strands of long hair laying around the floor and furniture. This time, there seemed to be more. I quickly went and checked the bedroom and also noticed the hair inside the bedroom again. Then I went and slowly checked around the corners of the hallway and kitchen, but didn't notice any more hair than 1 or 2. Finally, I went into the bathroom, where my husband and I get ready in the morning. But there were only evidence of our own short hair. I even went as far as checking the bed and pillow for hair because if our hair is falling out that much that it's filling the living room and bedroom, I kind of figured most should be on the pillows or bathroom. But once again, I only found evidence of our short hair. It was only a strand or 2. I tried not to think too much about it and quickly finished cleaning and mopping the whole apartment corner to corner, then left for work. By the time I got off work, I completely forgot about the events in the morning because I was exhausted from a long night of work and just wanted to get home and dive into bed and sleep. The whole apartment was dark when I opened the door to enter, indicating that my husband was probably asleep, so I decided not to turn on the lights to distract him. Instead, I turned the flashlight on my phone and guided my way towards the bedroom. I was planning to quickly grab some clothes, shower, and just get into bed. But as I opened the bedroom door, from the small amount of light coming through the window, I can make out the bump on the bed, my sleeping husband. But my eyes were quickly drawn to a silhouette of a woman standing beside him on the bed. The first thing that came to my mind was that he was cheating on me. So I quickly reached out and turned on the bedroom lights. I was ready to pounce on my husband. But right as the light came on, the silhouette figure suddenly disappeared right before my eyes. I felt a deep drop in my heart, and my body suddenly grew weak. Before I knew it, my knees started shaking uncontrollably. I knew what I was feeling, and it was pure terror. My husband quickly jumps out of bed like he was out of breath, and looked up at me like he was surprised to see me. I don't know if he even noticed the fear on my face, but before I can say anything, he jumped out of bed and flew into my arms, shouting, "Onk, thank you, honey, for waking me up. I was having the worst nightmare ever. I couldn't move my body and like I was being sat on." What my husband said to me terrified me even more. But I decided not to say anything to him or scare him anymore, so I just quickly brushed the fear off and told him to go back to sleep. As I laid there in that bed that night, all I felt and heard was the pounding of horror in my heart. For sure, when those lights came on earlier, I believe that what I saw was a long-haired, pale female woman towering over my husband, with her eyes rolled back and blue dead tongue hanging loosely at the side of her mouth. The girl in the graveyard is your best friend, so you take her home. The night is a bruise between you, a blotch of rogue in the passenger window, the colour of fruit left out to fester. The body pries at her seatbelt, a finger, then two. The radio echoes static, the body shuffles in her seat. You study the face, the similar slice of jaw, the nose humped from where a baseball had hit her at 12, just slightly off centre. The skin like a rain-licked plastic bag, the stink of musk and sulphur. You want to look away, but you cannot. She's so beautiful, even like this. Your headlights rake warbled slits through the dirt road, a yellow like jaundice. Your hands are stiff from the cold, your lips cracked. The girl beside you is dead, and you are bringing her home. 4 days ago, you'd stepped into a hardware store and emerged with a shovel sturdy enough to lift a life on. 4 days you'd spent digging dirt in your own backyard yard until loam muddied under your fingernails and erratic holes split garden beds like the mouths of greedy beasts. Until you could sift through soil with your eyes closed, with a hand bound. 4 nights you had laid in your bed, staring at the pockmarked ceiling, wondering what it felt like to burn alive. Now, the shovel beats dull against the skin of your trunk, your hands gripping the steering wheel like a throat you're trying to silence. The body turns, dawn bleaching the salmon grey of her skin. The left eye slips from its socket and she pushes it back in with the heel of her hand. She smiles, head lolling like a marionette's, "Sorry, baby." Her voice comes out strained. "I wasn't expecting company. I'm sure you understand." In a sickle of citrus moonlight, Adeline Marcus smiles up at you with shell-pale gums. Adeline Marcus died on the 31st of October and was buried a week later, the date on her gravestone a month shy of her 18th birthday. In the court, the boys would claim it was an accident, that they didn't know she was inside. For better or worse, you believe them. The fingers striking out matchboxes, the beer cans constellating the sidewalk, a prank gone too far, the wrong place, the wrong time. It doesn't have to be on purpose. She didn't have to be home. The coroner ruled it suffocation, but all you can imagine is flame like a stiff palm striking over and over. Adeline had crawled from the mouth of the home on her hands and knees. She was dead by the time she reached the pavement, her Sunday dress singed up to her knees, the dress you knew well enough. Either way, the boys were left with 25 to life, and the Marcuses were left with a dead daughter, a ring of ash like chalk on the pavement. You were left with a misplaced guilt like hunger, a guilt like an Ouroboros, choking on the tail, swallowing the head, eating yourself alive and being unable to stop even as it consumes you. because this wasn't the sort of thing that happened to good people. You watch water curl down your shower drain, carrying with it mortuary makeup, kaleidoscopic insects and jasmine bubbles. Strings of dirt stretched out like sinew. The body's head rests on her knees, vertebrae needling through her back like a line of molars. The electric lights wash her green, dark veins rooted under brittle skin. She turns her face to the showerhead and picks at the powdery sediment under her fingernails. The shower floor is a mess of grit, and you think of a child scooping up the sand. You turn the heat up until it scalds and scrub mildew from the base of the shower door. You think, if you can only get everything clean, everything will be all right. She turns her head and looks at you through eyes obscured by glass paneling. She says, "It's not as bad as all that. I don't even think I felt a thing." But she says it through lips the color of spoiled plums, so the sentiment doesn't ring true. You lift threadbare towels from the bottoms of your linen closet. You walk 3 times around your block and return to a corpse sat on your sofa like she has nowhere better to be. There are ants in your sugar bowl. You try to remove them, lift their crystal knotted bodies on the prong of a fork, but they slip between the gaps and you are left with a mess bigger than when you started. Tea-brown sludge bleeding from thoraxes and the stink of vinegar. There's a dead girl on your sofa, but let's focus on the ants in your sugar bowl. The way they thread through cysts of white like veins on a leaf, like the capillaries that run through the skin of your face. You make tea anyway. You add too much milk and sit cross-legged in front of the body. She stares at you. You stare back. The two of you drink, and ribbons of watery milk pour clean out her trachea, the gaping hole in her chest, but she doesn't stop drinking until you do. "You're not looking at me," she says. "Not really." "Yes, I am." You twist your hands in the shag carpet. "Aren't I now?" "No," she says. "You're not." You leave your teacup on the floor, saucer and iris of yellow, and go upstairs. You take 2 cigarettes from the carton squashed on your father's desk and then think better of it, press down with your heel until tobacco dissipates into the tawny carpet. You change your bed sheets twice, eggshell white, no, grey with peonies. You make a second cup of tea. When you get back to the room, the body is still there. You are looking at her. You are not looking at her. "Do I disgust you?" she says. "No." She shakes her head, dark hair plastered to her shoulders like reeds. "No more than I always did." "You need to sleep," you say. "Baby?" She tilts her head to one side. "Sleeping is all I've ever done." The last time you saw Adeline Marcus alive was in the back of a stranger's car, parked on a stranger's street with the taste of a stranger's tequila fresh between your lips. You were never too built for parties, so the outcome was a pair of girls who looked like they were playing dress-up. Blousy dresses with sleeves like a nun's. Thrift store necklaces noosing your necks. Shoplifted lipstick which she hid beneath her mattress, more wax than pigment. But in the citrus peel of streetlights, in the low trill of distant music, the two of you looked beautiful. She had her legs curled under her and was sitting sideways in the back seat, her hand resting on your knee and the other palmed against the window, a song on her lips that you couldn't quite place. You were too close, but it was night, and everyone was inside and drunk, and sometimes we all need to feel closer than we should be, to lose ourselves a little. The song melted on her lips, swallowed into the limp press of salvia and booze, and you said something like, "I think I should go home now." And she said something like, "Have another drink." And so you did. You let her pour the liquor into the flimsy mouths of red plastic cups and watched her swallow. She said, "You're so pretty." And you said, "I think you should stop." And she said, "Just let me say that one thing." And you wanted to say, "Stop fucking looking at me like that." And you wanted to say, "I want to crawl inside you and make a life for myself in the city of your mind." And you wanted to say, "Let's just be quiet. Let's just not talk. Let's just not ruin a good thing by telling the truth." Instead, you pushed open the passenger door, stumbled out onto the skin of vein blue sidewalk. "I'm going home now." The body lays with her back to your bed, hands worming in the floral sheets, chestnut hair spilling across her throat, past the ballpoint pen-marred bedposts, over the grey skin of her forehead. You are thinking about the silken mouth of a coffin. You are thinking of how she looked when you pulled her from the rose mouth of heaven. The radiator hums. A lace curtain bellies your open window. She rolls over onto her side, slots her hands together like pieces of a decaying jigsaw puzzle. You still can't even look at me. Her mouth moves too slowly, words like chewing gum. Why am I here, Bet? What's it for? There are pink crescent moons on the bed of your palms from the bite of your nails. She pulls her knees to her chest, and a bone cracks. She pulls her knees to her chest, and a molar tumbles from between her keyhole lips. You can only love me when I'm not here. You can only love me when there's nothing left to love. You press your cheek to the cool spread of linen beside her. You listen to the steady beat of your heart, the way you can feel it in your fingertips, entirely singular. Don't tell anyone, you say. Did you want it to die with me, Bet? She shifts, and her hair falls against the nape of your neck. Were you glad it was silenced? Don't tell anyone, you say again. She sighs, lays herself back down so you're face to face. Crooked nose, eye pulling from its socket, the onset of grey-green decay wreathing her jaw. The smell of soil and rot and cicada-heavy nighttime. Who could I tell? She brushes your hand. I'm not really here. And suddenly, you can imagine it is your fists splitting beer cans in two like overripe fruit. It is your fingers on the matchbox, your fingers striking out. But you both know the house would still be on fire, and you both know you'd leave alone. You take her hand. You put your face in the crook of her neck and beg forgiveness from a ghost. My sister has always had a soft heart. Soft as sweetbread. She cried after the old woman, despite everything. Maybe because of everything. I remember holding her as she wept, both of us covered in soot, her fingers scalded from holding shut the oven door. After the tears, she was quiet. She trailed me through the awful house with its sweetbread walls and sugared windows. I found the clothes we'd arrived in, offered up her kirtle, and she donned it without a word. She showed no whisper of response when we found the treasure in the attic, only nodded vaguely when I asked her to help me fill up the few bags we could easily carry back through the woods. Maybe it would be enough. Enough to keep us safe from our stepmother's whims. I do not want to go back there. It was the first she'd spoken in hours. I hesitated outside the witch's cottage, looking back over my shoulder at her. I do not want to go back to them. I sighed. Nor do I. But where else can we go? She wrung her fingers together in front of her skirt, eyes downcast and her teeth digging into her lower lip. Eventually, though, she nodded. Fine, you're right. She looked back at the house. Wait 1 minute. There may be something left in the kitchen. The kitchen? I repeated in horror, but she only nodded. Yes. She did not think I paid attention, but I did. I know which of her potions might be useful. If nothing else, we can sell them when we get back. I nodded slowly and followed her back into the cottage, though I stopped in the open arch that led into the kitchen itself. She moved easily through the space, reminding me painfully of just how long she had been under the witch's thumb while the horrid crone tried to fatten me like a prize hog. She collected some dozen bottles and vials, tucking them carefully in between the bolts of silks and satins we had pilfered from the attic before returning to me. Let us go. Though there was no trail this time, she seemed to know her way through the trees. I asked how, once, when we paused to wait out the dark. But all she said was that she simply knew now, as though the forest spoke to her in a way it hadn't before. I felt the first thrill of fear at that, but I knew that she was still so scared herself. I refused to let her see it. I tried to coax her into dreaming about what sort of life we might have with the witch's pilfered treasure, and managed to earn a wan smile for my efforts. But it was cold and dark, and soon enough we simply huddled together under a gnarled tree as we waited for the deepest part of night to pass. When greyish dawnlight began to filter through the leaves, she was the first to stand. She had gone quiet again, and only answered me with faint hums or single words as we continued on our way. She seemed more comfortable to be leading us now, but something in the set of her shoulders reminded me of something I could not quite name. Eventually, I lapsed into her silence. When the trees broke apart to reveal the familiar shape of our father's home, she froze. Then she broke into a run, and I was only half a step behind her. The door was already opening when we reached the stoop, and our father met us with his arms open and tears in his eyes. He held us close and apologized, over and over, praising the Lord's name. I embraced him in turn, but alongside the relief in my chest, there was an anger in my gut. It had started a spark, but over the length of our trek back through the woods had grown into a steady flame. I met my sister's eyes over our father's shoulder, and a chill ran through me. If my anger was a flame, then hers was the dead cold of darkest winter. Our father explained that our stepmother had been stricken ill not long after we left. She was in her room now, asleep, and had been for days. He did not expect her to recover, though he had been following the physician's orders as best he could. "Perhaps she shall rally to see you," he offered us hopefully. When neither of us answered, he sighed and dragged a hand down his thick beard. There was more grey in it than I remembered. "I know you must be angry with me, with us," he told us wretchedly, "that I could lose track of you so easily. It is an unforgivable failing in a father." "Lost?" I started slightly at the sharp edge in my sister's voice. Our father did too. She had always had a soft voice to match her heart. "We were lost," she repeated, staring at him intently. Our father stared back, eyes wide with a hint of fear. "Lost," he confirmed at last in little more than a whisper. I dropped my eyes, unable to continue looking at him. My sister did not. Abruptly, she stood from our small table. "We will go see her then." I blinked, startled both by the sudden movement and the conviction in her voice, but I followed her into our stepmother's sick room. That flame of rage flickered a little higher in my chest, and I found that I could not make myself move more than 2 steps inside the door. My sister knelt beside the hateful woman and smoothed a hand over her brow in a gesture so tender it made me want to break something. "Here." She tipped one of the witch's vials against her lips. "This will help." I almost reached out to stop her, but as though she sensed the movement, she held a staying hand back toward me. When the vial was empty, she stood and brushed her hands down the front of her skirt. She did not look at me as she left the room. I hesitated a moment longer behind her, staring at the woman who had left us to the wood and the wild. Already, her breathing seemed easier. Anger and love for my sister warred, twin flames in the center of my chest. She had always borne such a soft heart. Our stepmother was awake and lively within a day. Though shocked by our return, she was mollified enough by the offerings of treasure we had stolen away with that she simpered and even summoned up some mockish tears through which to tell us she was so sorry we had been lost to the wood. My rage burned hotter, and my sister grew colder. "We should celebrate your return," our stepmother exclaimed, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, but no other sign of her illness remaining. "What do you wish for supper, my darlings?" "Sweetbread." I jerked around to stare at my sister, eyes wide and mouth agape. She did not so much as glance at me, but I felt her hand take mine under the table. She smiled at our stepmother, and my throat went dry. "But you are still recovering, stepmother." "I feel quite well, all things considered." "I shall make it," she offered gently. I could have stopped her then, could have clutched her hand in mine and dragged us out. We could have taken the treasure and left. It had been foolish of me to think there was nowhere for us to go. We might go anywhere. Seeing our father again, hearing him refuse to admit what they had done, made me sure of that. But my sister looked at me, just for a moment, and the ice in her gaze froze me to my chair. She was not looking for permission, but I nodded shakily anyway. Our stepmother exclaimed what a good, kind girl she was as she moved into the kitchen. Soon enough, the cloying smell of the baking sweetbread hung thick in the air. It was all I could do not to gag. My sister served the plates while the bread was still steaming gently, even drizzling the last of our honey stores over our parents' portions. "We can always get more at the market now," she said, with a hollow little laugh. Our stepmother agreed happily, though our father hesitated a moment before doing so himself. He was watching my sister with a faint wariness as she took her seat beside me. "Go on then, let us eat." They did. We sat in silence. It took our stepmother first. A faint cough, a furrow in her brow. She looked up with confusion, which changed quickly to a horrified realization as she stared at my sister. "You—" Our father choked, red spattering his lips. I looked away, squeezing my sister's hand tight, where she had once more taken it beneath the table. We were desperate," he strangled out, reaching for her pleadingly. "I did not want to. She made me." My sister shook her head. "You let her." He collapsed forward onto the table, his breath a wheezing rattle that grew fainter with each passing moment. Our stepmother tried to lunge for us, but her legs gave out and she sprawled across the floor. A scarlet trail, like candied jam, trickled from the corner of her mouth. "You—" she gasped again, glaring balefully up at my sister. "You— little witch." They both began to convulse. I buried my face in my sister's shoulder. I could feel her stroking my hair. Even without raising my head, I knew she did not look away until their last breaths had faded into silence. Then she simply stood, her hand still in mine. We were both silent as we gathered up our bags, still unpacked by the front door, and stepped out into the cool evening. "You are afraid." I swallowed. Yes." She smiled at me, squeezed my hand again, and all I felt was cold. "You do not need to be. I will protect you." My sister has always had a soft heart, soft as poisoned sweetbread. 2 years ago, I stared into the eyes of a little dead girl. She was sprawled on some highway, deep in what used to be the Midwest, her dead, fermenting eyes staring past me, and up, 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 into the sun-bleached sky. They didn't leave many bodies behind when they left. Didn't want to find skeletons when they came back, I assume. Her skin was dark and leathery. There was a hole growing in her cheek. Blue tendrils came twirling out of the rotted, bony mass with those little orange tips. I wished they were green. I miss the trees, the grass. The closest thing to nature are the dead bodies with the synthetic viruses, eating themselves towards the clouds. Puny, fingernail scratches on deep blue skin. She might have been dead for 3 months, 6 at a stretch. The first thing I felt when I saw her was excitement. She was the closest thing I'd seen to another person in 6 years. My father's body had been more pristine, less infected by the now, a perfect conservation of the then. There was only the tight, red little hole in his temple, the pool of dark, sticky blood pooling around bits of his brain, staring at me like a sick, foaming, red-furred dog. His eyes were stained red by blood, and they sat uncomfortably in their sockets, dislodged by the force of a bullet tearing it all up behind them. He was smiling, a slash of red teeth, red eyes popping. I half expected them to flick towards me, half expected the revolver, still lying loosely in his palm, to fire a matching shot through my own temple. I was relieved when he killed himself, as I was when I saw the dark hole in that little girl's cheek. I took the gun. I took his shoes. I turned around, and I left. As I reached the crest of the yellow hill, I looked back at him, lying like roadkill on the highway, in the dead, yellow grass, our truck lying upside down, smoking, a few feet away. I wiped blood from my forehead, and I pressed on, the sun belching like a toad white bubble of heat that burst around me periodically. There was a similar gunshot in the little girl's calf that poked out from her purple nightgown. It was the nightgown that made me vomit. I heaved onto the tarmac. I heaved, and I heaved. She was so young, the same age as me probably, when I left my father's corpse to rot in the fat white sun that turned the sky grey from its heat. It happened in the night, I thought, sitting on the tarmac, staring at the little dead girl. There were sun-baked faint tire marks on the road. She had gone, I thought. So young. She died, seething with red-hot pain, alone in the inky night. Not an inkling of who she once might have been. The sun was rising, the sky was losing her blue. The pile of vomit to my side would begin to cook soon, like a stinking goose egg in a frying pan. I stood up. I looked at her once more, a china doll, cracked up and fading in the sun. I turned my head back to the road, the tarmac melting into a black puddle on the horizon. It had been the last wink of winter that day, or what would have been winter. My diary says so, March 3rd. It's almost definitely wrong. The last time I was really sure of the day, the month, the year. I was 9. The day the school caught fire and burned down. The village burned for a week. The school was first, a black plume into the purpley-grey midday sky. The grass was already threadbare, yellow. The buildings were lazy, wooden shacks standing crooked, haphazard, peeling rows like a pile of matches. It's difficult to build, gather materials, do anything at all, when you swelter all day under a rock or in a shack, waiting for the midnight hours. The village burned, and then Grandma picked up bleach on the exodus, and soon everybody was gone, my father on his way. That day, after seeing the dead girl, I had collected enough gas and food to wait out the summer in the caves. They were damp, dripping places if you went down far enough. It stank of rotted bodies, those who had starved or gone. But it was cool. It was dark. It was safer than third-degree burns and snarling tumours all summer long. I remember I'd left it so late that I knew to stop driving and lie in the grass under the car. I usually passed out from the heat after an hour or so. When the sun was lower in the sky, orange and red, the sky green and pink, I poured water over myself, guzzled it through my cracked, bleeding lips. And then I drove and I drove. I'd left it so late, so dangerously late, that towards the end of the journey, they started appearing in the sky. Small black dots at first, but they got bigger. They're ships, full of, I don't know, probably scientists in grey coats, watching, waiting for everything to die so they could start again. They're nothing but black pebbles in the sunset to me, and they disappear in the safety of the night. Black pebbles, no windows, no movement, no noise. They've no exhaust fumes, no visible sign of life. They just float calmly in the sky, black beads, watching as Earth eats itself like a coyote starving in the desert, picking at its own ribcage for morsels of its fleshy stomach. A stomach long gone. That little dead girl was a premonition, I suppose. It had been a silent, dissociative half-decade of white, silent heat. Each year dripped onto my lips like the last of the water in the hip flask I dangle, now, as I speak, above my head. I should have been gone for the caves days ago. I stand on the roof of a gas station. It's midday. The sky is clear and grey. The yellow-brown plains sprawl outwards, forever on all sides. The highway cuts a black line down the middle. There's the occasional lone ranger, a telephone post in the distance, the hollow carcass of a tree. It's silent. So silent. Silence as deafening as a red sea, crashing down on my shoulders and burrowing into my dry, blistered throat. There's blood leaking from the blisters in my cheeks. It starts to boil slowly, etching teary burns down my chin, down my neck. I don't feel it. I don't feel anything. I'm a pair of eyes. I forgot the cave long ago. I've been waiting for this day, the last day of winter, the last wink. I hold my arms outstretched. From somewhere far away, much bluer and greener, much louder, if I squint, I can feel them burn like an old photograph on the campfire. The sensation starts to feel like rain, cold and relieving. I bleached myself intentionally. I went to one of the rotted bodies deep in the caves. A man. In the torchlight, his eyes were milky and half-closed, his mouth slack. There was a bottle of something that had rolled away from his right hand. There were foamy remnants on his lips. He reminded me of my little brother, Jeffrey. Maybe if he had grown up in the green and blue world, then he would have looked like that. I kissed his forehead. I began to forget not long after. It was sweet. It was like falling slowly asleep from this nightmare. This fucking nightmare, I hear myself scream from far away in the blue and green. I start to turn away now, as my legs begin to give out on the roof of the gas station. I can feel nothing holding out his hand. The blistered now is a universe away. Just before I turn and walk down the hill, the rain pouring onto my neck, blurring my vision into a sweet, comfortable grey, expansive, eternal grey. I see that little dead girl lying on the highway, sprawled out on the scorched earth. I smile as I slip away. I smile at her red, unblinking eyes. I experienced this when I was 10 years old a long time ago. My family and I were visiting our first cousins in Minnesota during the July 4th tournament. It was the first time seeing them in a long time. They fled from Laos along with my parents when I was still a little toddler. My aunt and uncle had a son that lives there and was around my age. We got along well together, joked around, and played video games. Then on the third night, we were playing a game of truth and dare with my younger sister and his older brother and sisters. They were 2 to 3 years older. I was up and picked dare. My cousin dared me to go into the basement with the lights off. They say they sometimes see a Hmong lady in red down there, and she comes up some nights. I was young and was already scared and refused to go down to the basement alone. Later that night, while everyone was asleep, besides my aunt and uncle because they were still up doing opium, I slept on the living room floor with 2 of my other cousins while my sister slept on the couch. My parents were sleeping in one of the rooms upstairs. I just couldn't sleep because of the smell from the opium. All of a sudden, I noticed the doorknob on the basement door rattle, like someone was trying to turn it. With just the moonlight shining into the living room, I could clearly see the doorknob slowly turn. The basement door squeaked as it slowly opened. That's when I thought about what my cousin said about the Hmong lady in red. That's when I saw her stepping out around the door. She looked like a young woman in Hmong clothes, maybe in her 20s, and she was glowing transparent red. She walked by the couch where my sister and girl cousin were sleeping, just looking at them. Then the lady in red noticed me. I was frozen in fear. I didn't know if it was real or if it was just a dream. The lady saw me looking at her and started walking towards me as she came around the corner of the couch. I didn't see her feet. It was as if she was floating. Now she was 5 feet away from me, getting closer and closer. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't yell for help, and I couldn't move. As the lady in red was about 2 feet away from me, my mom turns on the light, and the Hmong lady in red just vanishes into thin air, like a magic trick. She was gone. No sight of her anywhere. But before she vanished, I saw her face as she turned her head around and back, before my mom turned on the lights. She had this sad yet angry look on her face before she vanished. My mom came downstairs to talk to my aunt and uncle before we left in the morning. The next morning, I told my aunt and uncle and my parents about it. You know how adults usually tell kids. It was just a dream, or we were just imagining things. But inside, they know what we saw. I am in my mid-20s now, and I can still clearly remember how she looked like. There was one really old Hmong couple that had no kids. Since they didn't really have anyone to take care of them, they were always short on money and didn't have any money for an AC during the summer. One night, the man told his wife, since it was so hot, then they should move the bed right under the window and open the window so it wouldn't be so hot while they slept. The wife agreed, and they moved the head of the bed right beneath the window. As they were sleeping, the lady felt something touching her face. So thinking that maybe it was just bugs, she just whipped her face with her hands trying to get it was to buzz off. Then again, she felt something touching her face. She did the same thing once again. A few moments later, again she felt something touching her face. This time, she was ticked off and tried to grab was touching her face so she could squash it. As soon as she caught it, she noticed it wasn't a bug but felt like a small hand. She opened her eyes and noticed she was holding onto a little hand that came from outside the window. She kicked her husband, and as he awoke, he witnessed what she was holding. A little in shock, he immediately looked outside to see if there was anyone right out by their window, in case it was a burglar. What he saw was nothing but a really long arm that came from the woods, which was about 20 feet away. He immediately told his wife to let go. As soon as she did, the hand shot back like a rubber band back to the forest. He told his wife what he saw, and immediately they freaked out and shut the window, being forced to stay up all night. The old folks said something about how you aren't supposed to sleep like that because it meant you were welcoming the dead to come sleep with you or something. That was why the hand was bothering the old lady.